We are now 214 days away from the midterms, and President Trump is shaking up his cabinet yet again. Attorney General Pam Bondi has officially been fired by the president less than a day after the New York Times reported he had grown frustrated with her leadership at the Justice Department. The Times reports he removed her, quote, after privately venting his frustrations for months over her handling of the Epstein files and her failed efforts to prosecute his political enemies, unquote. Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche will serve as acting Attorney General, but at least for now, he is not exactly considered a shoo-in for the full-time role. For that, MS Now reports former Republican Congressman turned EPA Administrator Lee Zeldin is on the short list to replace her, according to 3 sources familiar with the matter. And unsurprisingly, Zeldin is known for his fierce loyalty to President Trump. Watch this.
President Trump will give you confrontation. He's not backing down from anyone. He's the alpha male in every room.
Thank you, Mr. President, for being willing to take a bullet for this country. He is willing to take a bullet for all of you tuning in at home.
Why is it okay if a House Democrat calls for violence in the streets, but not if you're a Republican?
MS Now reports other possible replacements include Jeanine Pirro, Republican Senator Eric Schmidt, and Trump's former personal lawyer, Alina Habba, who, as you may remember, was disqualified by an appeals court from serving as New Jersey U.S. Attorney. That's according to 4 people familiar with the situation. With that, I want to bring in our leadoff panel, Peter Baker, Chief White House Correspondent for the New York Times, Charlie Sykes, author of the Substack newsletter To the Contrary, and host of a podcast by the same name, and former U.S. Attorney Joyce Vance, who spent 25 years as a federal prosecutor. Peter, I want to start with you. What's your take on this firing and what we know thus far? Is this really just about the fact that the Dow finally fell below 50,000?
Well, that's right. She told us at those hearings, focus on the Dow. And obviously, it's not where it was when she first testified. Look, it's about a broader disappointment that's been going on for a while. The president doesn't like to fire people, or at least cabinet officials, at the moment they're most under fire. He waits until later, so it doesn't look like he's doing it in response to criticism or in response to the chattering class, if you will. But he's been dissatisfied, obviously, with Attorney General Bondi for some time. It's the Epstein files. It's the failure to bring prosecutions against some of his political foes. Not that she didn't try, but that she didn't succeed. I think her side of it would say, look, she did try. She did everything that he asked her to do. The fact that the grand juries and judges wouldn't go along, in their case, this argument is that it's not her fault. But in any case, he has certainly decided that she's not the one to go forward.
Joyce, Trump also reportedly fired Bondi in part because he didn't like how she handled the Epstein files, as Peter's colleagues reported. But not to defend Pam Bondi, but what could she actually have done differently that would have made him happy? It's not her fault that he and his pals are all over the files.
You know, Pam Bondi's conduct as Attorney General is simply indefensible. So I think you're right to point that out. The question is whether the president can expect to get anything better from his next Attorney General. He seems to have constantly educated himself about what it is that matters, starting out with a Jeff Sessions, who, of course, gave him a special counsel during his first term, moving on to Bill Barr, who stopped short, just at the point of participating in insurrection, leaving to spend time with family a couple days ahead of Christmas. And so now we have Pam Bondi, who was the consummate Trump loyalist, willing to bring cases that every legal expert who looked at them agreed were specious and should never even be attempted in front of a grand jury with the predictable outcome in court. Now it seems like Trump will try to marry up his desire for loyalty with someone who can show a little bit of competence. But what really downed Bondi's performance when it came to the Epstein files was the detail work that the Justice Department is so extraordinarily good at. It really is in many ways the world's biggest law firm. So turning over discovery in these very large cases while protecting victims' identities and other sensitive information, that's something that Main justice and every U.S. attorney's office across the country is very good at doing, meeting courts' expectations in that regard. And this is something that Bondi's Justice Department with struggled over and over again, to the point of revealing nude photographs of some of the victims and survivors that had identifying sorts of content to them, revealing documents that, for instance, exposed survivors while protecting identities of perpetrators. That, I don't think, bothered the president as much as what she was forced to do in some of these cases, revealing information that was ultimately damaging to Donald Trump. He may have wanted her to keep it all close, but Bondi, in turning stuff over that was consistent with what Congress dictated, made revelations that were damaging to this president. And the calls will continue for this information to be released. Still, there are millions of documents that DOJ hasn't turned over. That fervor won't go away no matter who Trump brings into the Kennedy building on Pennsylvania Avenue.
Yeah, exactly. The things that most of us may criticize Pam Bondi for getting wrong in the handling of the Epstein files are probably completely antithetical to the things that Donald Trump is upset about. And to your point, Charlie, firing Pam Bondi gets rid of Pam Bondi. It doesn't get rid of the Epstein controversy, which continues to haunt this administration. Will this accomplish anything in that regard?
Well, I would urge people to restrain their schadenfreude, because nothing's going to get any better at the Department of Justice. One of the reasons why Pam Bondi was fired was she was insufficiently awful. She botched the rollout and the cover-up of the Epstein files, but she also was unable to hand Donald Trump what he most wanted, was more heads on a platter. She was, unable to satisfy Trump's appetite for retribution. So her successor is unlikely to be an improvement, and is unlikely to undo the incredible damage that Pam Bondi has done. I mean, let's just step back for a moment. I think it is fair to say that Pam Bondi may have been the most egregiously awful attorney general in the history of that office, and the damage she has done has been far-reaching to the independence of the Department of Justice. And whoever takes her place is not going to repair that, is not going to fix any of that. And so in terms of what Donald Trump is doing, there appears to be kind of a great purge going on, where we're getting more and more speculation about other members of the cabinet that he might fire. But what we ought to remember is that everything flows from Donald Trump. Everything that happens at the Department of Homeland Security flowed from Donald Trump. Everything that's happening in the Department of Justice flows from Donald Trump. So Pam Bondi, does not deserve our sympathy or our pity. But don't expect that things are going to turn around, or the damage that she has done is going to be repaired anytime soon, particularly if it's somebody like a Todd Blanchard, some of those other candidates that you mentioned that feel more like a troll than serious suggestions for successors.
So, Peter, as Charlie alluded to, there have been rumors about other cabinet officials who might be getting the boot. Bondi is number 2 who's been fired in less than a month. Do you think that the president is getting more comfortable pushing some of his cabinet members out? And could we see more heads rolling?
Yeah, I think that's possible. No, look, this is a president who likes to fire people, right? I think people have gotten the wrong impression from his first year, when he wasn't firing cabinet people, to think that somehow there wasn't the same turnover that we saw in his first term. There's been a lot of turnover in the second term Trump White House. It just hadn't been at the cabinet level, because he didn't like the idea of responding to others in that sense. He didn't want to give the impression of disarray, which happened a lot the first time around. But now I think you're right. I think, having done this twice in the last few weeks, he's finally scratching that itch. He's finally, doing what he wants to do. He doesn't seem to care as much if it creates an impression of chaos in his administration. He's kind of a chaos agent, and he doesn't really see a downside to that. He's willing to chop off heads where he thinks people have failed him. But the message that has happened now from Kristi Noem and Pam Bondi, neither of whom was a never Trumper, neither of whom was a restrainer, to use the word that people use. They're not conventional establishment Republicans who are trying to stop him. They were Republicans who were true believers who simply didn't go far enough, as Charlie said. And I think that the message, therefore, to the remaining members of the cabinet, remaining senior people in Trump's administration is you better not let up on the gas.
Well, I mean, to the extent that the law allows you, I guess. But Joyce, Lee Zeldin is reportedly high on the list of potential replacements, which is a little bit surprising given the fact that Todd Blanche is already Deputy Attorney General, now Acting Attorney General. So why do you think not Blanche? Or maybe what does Zeldin bring to the table?
Right. So look, Todd Blanche would face an uphill confirmation proceeding. You know, confirmation is never easy when you're already the Deputy Attorney General, because that gives senators who are so inclined a lot of information to come shooting at you with. And Blanche is particularly vulnerable. He's been involved in everything from the incident with the deportations to Seacott Prison, where a judge's order was directly not followed by the Justice Department. His fingerprints are there, along with his former colleague, Emil Bove. And that goes on and on up to, of course, this disastrous interview that he did with Ghislaine Maxwell that resulted in her statement that Donald Trump had engaged in no misbehavior that she had observed. And there appeared to be a quid pro quo for that comment, a reward. Her movement to a minimum security facility, completely inconsistent. And this is something that boggles the mind with someone who's received a conviction and a sentence like she did for sex trafficking to then be moved to a minimum security facility and given all sorts of benefits, access to a puppy, for instance. It's just completely unprecedented. I think it would be tough for Blanche to answer questions under oath about how all of that shook out. But that's just the tip of the iceberg, really. He would have had a tough time in confirmation.